So I think you could have predispositions, but I don't care. It means nothing. I think if you know that you have it, you also have the ability to change it. It's because I know I have those predispositions. I know I have that nature. But the fact that I know it means I can change it. I think it's in any sort of thing. Somebody says, oh, I know I'm lazy, and you continue to be lazy. Is you know it, you can change it.
Yeah.
You know you're prone to anger, so why don't you change it? I think people feel comfortable in the things that they say they know, and they attach it to their identity.
Well, I mean, think about star
Absolutely
signs.
afraid to admit that they're
Think about zodiac
Capricorn,
signs. I'm a Capricorn, so I punch people.
Yeah,
So you're
yeah,
Capricorn? I'm a
yeah.
No,
Capricorn.
I'm an
Accountability
Aquarius. I'm actually an Aquarius.
is
Oh.
lost.
No way.
But I think that's a great example of people that will say like, "Oh, I am this, therefore that's like what I am," and
this
like,
Yeah.
defines
and
identity.
it's just
Yeah.
defines who you are. And
Yeah.
I think it's actually a good example of
My
like
ex
how
is
you
one of
might
those.
use, yeah, you know, and
That's actually a red flag for me now. It's like,
I was actually more curious to see like your responses to what John was saying, but also because I partly disagree with John. I don't actually think like I think you were saying something around like it's what is it? It's that people can't distinct it or know it or certain things like that. I don't think that's true. I actually think I actually don't think it's that love. So for example, I think trust does have trust has a recipe.
Yeah.
And I think people know the recipe to trust, and I'd be hard pressed to find people that would disagree that like
Yeah.
you could say that there is or isn't trust. I think the only difference with love is that it's the one kind of like quote unquote emotion or thing that people kind of toss away and say like we can't know. It's the only one. Like I mean, I don't know any other emotion that people will say like you can't really define it. I've never heard someone tell me you can't really define like anger. You can't define like certain things. But here's the thing, like anger has different pieces to it that once they cease, it's no longer anger. It's like it could be annoyance, and there's importance for those distinctions, right? Like otherwise we might as well just call annoyance anger. We might as well even go to the extent of saying like, I mean, even at the beginning, I think you actually said like she hated you or something like that, or like use that language of like she loved me, but then like she gave me looks that she hated me, and you know, and be hard pressed to find a situation where like you could have both at the same time.
yeah.
So I think in that sense, I don't actually think it's hard to understand or know. I think it's that for whatever reason, society decides that like it's the one that we can't know, or that like it's up for discussion or it's up to anyone.
Yeah.
And we just, for whatever reason, I think refuse to tackle it. But I think even you, and I don't even think we have to go to the universal level of like the definition. I think, and this is where I would love to loop you two in, is you each had your own like understandings of what you believed love was. But I also noticed, and I'll like be quite frank, I also noticed a lot of contradictions with like the types of things that you described as love, but then not receiving them from those people. So even if you hold true to your own definition, if it's at the personal level, if that person isn't meeting those things to your standard, you know, at what point can you comfortably say that they had it for you if they weren't even meeting your criteria at your level? You know, and that's something that I struggled with a lot with my exes, was I always said like, oh, I loved them. They loved me. I loved them. I still love them. But here's the thing. I don't talk to my first ex. I'm pretty sure we don't even follow each other on social media. We don't engage. We don't communicate. So to me, like if we don't talk, I mean, there's a lot of things that I look back on and I know now that I don't believe that it was love, because I look back and I'm like, well, how could someone that says they love me, you know, go and do X, Y, and Z things that were like awful? And it doesn't mean that like she couldn't have, or like I couldn't have reached it, but I just don't think we got to that point, and I think that's okay. But the reason I say that is because like, you know, to be frank, just to say, if you two have your own personal definitions, but then we start to hear like, by we I mean like as you talk and as I've talked about my prior relationships, I felt myself contradicting myself, saying like, oh, this is what I believe love is, but then my partner's not showing it to me, and I'm telling everybody that she loves me or that I love her. I just think that mismatch is kind of important for us to realize, like, there is a way that we can say to ourselves, like, maybe they met 9 out of 10, but it wasn't love.
Yeah.
And last thing I'll say before I turn it over to you guys is I also find it really funny, the distinction of like true love, puppy love, like crush love, like all the types of love. But I don't ever, I just find that fascinating, because if it's not that, or if you know something not to be true, I get it maybe for name's sake, but for something as so important and like pretty and beautiful as love, like why not just call it what it is? Because then the moment that you do find it makes it that much more special, versus if you were to just say, oh, this is like a form of love, That's the only thing I had to say regarding that. I think it is easily understood once you see it and you've experienced it. It's just that we, for whatever reason, refuse to like have the conversations around it, or say that this is or isn't.
Well, my response to the kind of transgressions that would be leading indicators of true love actually not being present is that transgressive or, abusive behaviors are learned. And so they're not always this like intentional, like, like, for example, your partner doesn't reciprocate your kindness or the things that you do for them. They will criticize you or gaslight you into all oblivion, right? And you wonder to yourself, how can this person truly love me? How can there be true love in this relationship? Well, maybe those behaviors are a learned response to their environment. They're growing up, whether it be learned from their parents or from their friends. This is a defense mechanism or coping mechanism to the psychological trauma they experienced.
Sure.
Right? And so if you have true love in that relationship, you try and learn to navigate it and understand that this is not coming from like a malicious personality. This is a response to a historical trauma that they don't have the ability to respond in any other way, right? And so, but the thing is that the accumulation of said transgressions can lead to obvious discomfort and even a breakage in the relationship. So it's not that true love isn't present, it's the relationship. It's a more of a question of, can the relationship survive, right? Mm-hmm. Because as I stated before, I wondered if, based on how the relationship ended, whether we had true love for each other. We were saying that to each other too. We're like, we split. It was a train wreck, right? Like the second time we broke up was, not as much of a train wreck as the first time, but it was like, you didn't change, like you promised you would change, and then like, oh well, the other is emotionally like not present, like what's going on? And it's like, these learned behaviors from our respective histories are so strong that they continue to build up feelings of resentment, feelings of unhappiness, right? And that ultimately detracts from the relationship. It detracts from true love too, but it doesn't mean that that true love no longer exists. It's just, it is in an unhealthy environment. It cannot continue to survive. So something has to give, right? So the relationship, either the relationship dies or you stay long enough to find that you don't love each other.
Question. So you mentioned like the language of like, for it to survive, right? Yeah. Because it's in this environment. How does it grow in that environment in the first place? If there's critical ingredients that are, because here's the thing. I think a lot of times like people are quick to say I'm in love because there's a lot of like things that look like love. Yeah. But then what they find out, I've been in this situation, is like the environment looks great, like the forest, so for example, looks great, but the actual soil or the true nature of like the forest, so to speak, is not great. So I would wonder, was that really love that had grown and is now struggling to survive, or did it not foster in the first place, and that the two people need to do the work to clean the forest? Because I think an important distinction to make is, I agree that there are like tough things in our past that make it hard for us to be loving or to get to love. And I think that's an important distinction, is the idea of like, let's say I grew up in a household where like I found it commonplace where obviously this isn't real, but like if my father cheated, maybe I learned that behavior, that it's like okay, to cheat, right? I don't think for me that would mean that my partner now has to accommodate that. I think I need to do the work to fix the soil, to put myself in a position for love to grow. But until I fix that, I would argue that love did not grow and is now struggling to survive. I would argue until the soil is like tilled and fertilized and like put in those conditions, now the love can grow, and then it's up to the relationship to continue to foster the environment. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Because
I agree with that.
because otherwise it becomes a really tough conversation to then have. And I've known many people in situations where they were in relationships where, like, you know, their partner's past was very storied, awful, whatever. But here's actually a question for both of you. Do you think people with intense trauma that struggle to communicate well, do you think that they are able to find love easier or harder than other people?
Way harder.
I would say harder. I
Yeah,
mean,
of course.
from my personal experience,
Ooh.
not to go too deep, but I've had a pretty crazy life, crazy family. You know, my dad is saying he escaped communist Romania. He was an interrogator for the military. He didn't even have to leave.
Damn.
My uncle crashed one of their boats, and they're like going to kill him. So I was like, all right, screw it, I'll go with you. My dad was like up there.
Yeah.
So like, and by interrogator, I mean, what do you think interrogators were doing in communist countries? They're probably doing some crazy stuff. So I had this like very intense father who was a womanizer, you know, very good looking guy. He's always had this natural charm about him. Just talk to anyone. I used to work with him as a general contractor. I remember we went to this place called Chinatown. It's in my hometown. We're doing we're building a garage door for these apartments that they rent to nurses. And we were like walked up to Chinatown, these beautiful blonde girls, maybe 18, 19, walk out. I don't even remember what my dad said. He just said two comments and they're like, ah, and he's like, this is my son. They're like, hi. And I was like, oh my gosh. Like, it's just, he has that, you know, but also he's like crazy. And I don't think that necessarily just because you grow up in an environment of trauma and excess anger, that becomes you.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
John knows me. Like I'm
Definitely.
probably one of the most mild-mannered, chill people on the planet.
Yeah.
If you really poke me, I will explode. But that's like once in like 5 years, 10 years type of thing. It's like a giant thing. But that's only if you really poke the bear. That doesn't really happen. So I don't really think that like it's an excuse that my environment created me, because you have to actively work towards not being like that. You know, and I think the reason why I had such a high standard on my relationship was because my parents had such a bad relationship, or they have one.
Yeah.
Just one little disagreement. You do this, you spend the money. Oh, you do this. It's like, shut up. Like,
Question for you: Do you think you've put in work to go away from what your predispositions might have had you like turn out to be?
so there were times when I was younger where I was like kind of bully-ish. I've never been like, oh, I hit someone, but
Right.
I was definitely more of like an aggressive troll back in
Right.
the day, where I would like say things that like other people would get, like I'm making fun of someone, the person wouldn't really understand. It's kind of how it was at our school.
Yeah.
Where like you'd like say something that was like above someone's head, but it was like really messed up. They didn't really know, and then everyone would laugh around you, and they'd just be like, oh, ha,
Yeah.
they didn't really get it. And I kind of toned away from that when I started realizing like it's kind of characteristics of my father. And you know, I don't like hate my father. I feel like even like with this love discussion, like I've chosen to love my father, and I would die for him if I had to, because he sacrificed so much. But he hasn't really done anything for me that's like warrants true love.
Yeah.
Kind of like he's saying about his father. My dad gave me $100. Oh, hey dad, I need 20. Like this is a month later, I need $20. Well, I gave you 100, man. Like, what you doing? Like what? Like, I'm 15. I spent that on Taco Bell and hot Cheetos, you know. So, I don't know. I don't believe that just because of your environment, you can be this person. But I definitely believe that certain people are very susceptible to it.
Yeah.
I was lucky that I had like a very wise mother that really taught me how to just like be kind and compassionate. Get your friends water. Jonathan, why don't you get your friends water? Why don't you get them food? She just kind of instilled this southern hospitality in me that really kind of guided how I wanted to be the rest of my life. And my sister too, she was like my second mother. Just the kindest woman on the planet. Just always telling you, oh, just calm down. Just be happy, you know. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, just pray about it. You know, just very sweet, typical Christian conservative type of thing. But because of that, I do believe I'm a much kinder person than I could have been. Because my dad was a ruthless person. The things he would teach me, like, oh, never trust anyone. If someone's staring at you, you look around the room, get to know people, look in their eyes, know if they're their friend or not. Like really weird things you shouldn't be telling like a 5-year-old, you know. Kind of made me like a paranoid like spy state type of thing. So I think that's also what kind of led to me not wanting to be in my relationship anymore. It's because at a certain point you have to have a certain maturity to be like, you know what, this was my experience, this is my life, but I'm choosing to be something greater than that. Because it's really easy to just fall into a path and be like, oh, well, my dad cheated and then left, and then my mom and I were struggle. It's like, well, you hear stories like that, then you hear stories of people who are like, oh, well, then I just figured out how to get rich as hell. I became a doctor. I studied nonstop because I never wanted to experience this ever again. I wanted to save my parents. You know, it's like there's always a inverse reaction to a bad one or a good one. And it's about choosing what you want to do with your path in life. And I think that's really what kind of boiled down at the end of it. It wasn't like, oh, you're not helping me pay rent, you're not cooking. I don't expect these things. It's just like, if you're a healthy, functional person, you'd want to do this.
Yeah.
You'd want to do it with me. I don't even care if you do it for me. Just do it with me. Don't sit on the couch and watch, like, Below Deck and be like, oh, look at all these rich drunk people. It's like, I don't care, dude. I'm in the kitchen making $20 an hour. Like, so I think what it really boils down is just like maturity. Because like you were saying, you know, like I was contradicting myself. During this conversation, I've like really thought more about my relationship more than I ever have. And I wouldn't say there was true love. It was just there was like so much similarity. Like I remember there was one time we're like, okay, let's talk about baby names. 3, 2, 1. We both said Evelyn and Michael. Like, what the hell, you know? It's like just we always had things like that where it's like we'd say the exact same thing.
Right.
We'd have the same joke.
Right.
And it was like, okay, that's really weird. It was like we had like a very similar like just like thought process.
Yeah.
But also, you know, like our morals were completely unaligned. You know, it's like I've always been very generous. I remember there's a guy who's a usual at my thrift store. We always give him clothes, and he came up to me in the drive-thru line at Del Taco, and he was like, "Hey, can you just buy me a burrito? I don't want money." And I was like, "Sure." Then I wound up the window, and she was like, "I would have never done that." I was like, "What? Like, why not?" Like, to me, that's just crazy. So I don't know. It really boiled down to it's like a character thing and wanting to like grow with someone. If someone is just like stagnated, it's like, do you really want to go through that?
No.
It's like I'm not trying to be someone's savior. I'm not trying to help you through your issues. I have so many issues. We need to come together and build each other up so that those kind of wash away.
Dan, curious of your thoughts. I know I initially responded to that, so I'm curious if you have a response to anything that has been said or.
Yeah. So one thing I will say is that predisposition towards learned behaviors vary largely based on negative and positive reinforcement, right? Like if you have good examples to follow, then the trauma is not everything that you know, versus the person who is in an environment where they consistently grow up and they're, let's say, like, grown up with a single mother, and all their mother ever would do is gaslight them into total oblivion throughout their childhood, throughout their teens, and then they come into adulthood, and when they enter into relationships with somebody else, all they know how to do in response to maybe like a minor criticism or some feedback is to gaslight that other person and make them now victimize their partner, or victimize themselves in the eyes of their partner. Like, why are you making me out to be a victim, right? So I feel like there is a sense in, like, of course, like your environment doesn't define who you are, right? It can shape your behaviors. It can shape like your habits and patterns of behavior. It doesn't necessarily, it predisposes you to being a certain way, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will culminate in you becoming that person, right? Or your environment. So I mean, it's really like it's accumulation effect, right?
And I agree with what you're saying, because so I had a really harsh father, but I have 6 siblings, so I'm the 6th, and between all the siblings and even my dad, his moments, there's nothing but love in my family. We actually have all sacrificed in different ways for each other. So even though there was like a very bad example, I had the complete polar opposite, and the polar opposite was the one that was around all the time. So it's like, I could hear the screaming, but I always just kind of reduced it. It was just like annoying adult stuff, like pointless. But I also had my mom be like, you don't need to be like that. Very Christian forward, like just pray, follow God. But still, it's like, I'm glad I had that, because there are people where it's like they have an abusive mother and father,
right? And
then they don't have any emotional outlet. Well, that's just going to make you a very angry, emotional person, and then you're not going to have any understanding of how to actually be a functional person, and then you explode at people. And that's why I'm kind of still really reserved with relationships, is because I've never had like a proper role model or example of what a good relationship is. My parents, I was the baby. My oldest sibling is 55, and I'm 29. So I was like way at the end. My mom, she was geriatric pregnancy. Super. I'm so lucky I didn't, well, at least that I know of, born with crazy things, because I think she had me when she was 45. So like she was also just disconnected from like the reality of my upbringing. She barely knows how to text. You know, I grew up on the computer.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing about predisposition too, is that it's largely about like, you know, the pervasiveness of influences, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in my case, me and my ex were both only children. And I think it's, you know, when it comes to the reinforcement of negative behaviors, it's doubly worse when the person you look up to and love is also the person that is exemplifying the worst toxic behaviors, right? Because that's all you know what a good person and bad person can be, and you have no other examples to juxtapose that influential figure in your life. And so your predisposition is 100% coming from a single source, right? There's no differentiation. If you have no other role models, you have no other, you know, let's say siblings to kind of like, you know, counteract that influence coming from a source, then you have just 100, let's call it 100% susceptibility, right? And so I think, you know, in examining my own relationship too, it's like I mentioned before, like it was scary for me how much like my parents I became, because neither of them were good role models in that relationship. Constant bickering, never, and also putting it like on me, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, like we're fighting, you know, and putting Daniel in the center of it. There was never a good example, right? There was no one to turn to. It was a constant, like, so like my understanding of conflict is that you stay in it and you continue to battle it out until you come to a resolution. And what was a horrible combination in my relationship was that with my ex, it was like, well, she was the same way. So we'd continue to belittle each other until there's just like just smoldering ashes, right? And that was really like, I think that's ultimately what it came down to. But despite all that, and you know, this is where I have to examine, well, was it true love then, right? Because how can we do that to each other? Well, based on our susceptibility to these toxic behaviors, like I can't put it as like we made these transgressions based on malicious intent. We had no love for this person. We did it out of hatred, or we did it out of, you know, true like resentment. It wasn't necessarily that. It's just, you know, it's not that we had no other choice, but we were just so prone to these behaviors in the first place that it took for us to be separated to look back and say, wow, we were really prone to these behaviors. We should seek other relationships and figure out whether we're actually still in love with each other.
Yeah. Okay, reset real quick.
Yeah.
Because I'm like itching to respond. So I think it's all excuses. I do not agree with at all with the idea of nurture predisposition, just by right of my own story. Like, for example, growing up, there was only a couple people who knew about the situation going on in my house. And even my closest friends, I know Pashrama knew, but like a lot of my other closest friends had zero idea of the abuse that was going on at home, the neglect that was going on at home. And because the fact of the matter is I didn't tell them. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't want to tell anybody because I saw there was no reason for myself to share the awfulness at home. I'd rather experience joy outside of it. I, you know, as somebody with trauma, I dislike when people use it as sort of their personality.
Yeah.
And I'm only mentioning it now because, no, I do not like the predisposition thing because, for example, it's funny because when, for example, my dad was very abusive. And then my mom said, oh, well, you know, his dad was very abusive. He had trauma and all that stuff. And that's how it came out. I'm like, I have an abusive father as well. And I don't do that. And I think, here's the thing. I think the problem with predisposition is that it's, oh, this is the thing you've grown up with. It's all you know. And that's something I fundamentally disagree with. The examples I've seen were just, for example, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, seeing what a good uncle looks like. Like Fairly Odd, all these shows, just most of my examples in life, I had zero role model. So I'm the example of somebody who had zero role model. Like my family was never in the house. When my mom was working, dad was working. So I was sleeping on the couch all the time. And the thing, I remember my earliest memory was of my dad slapping my mother. And so like all I knew was abuse and neglect and a mother who enables that abuse, who allows that sort of thing. I love my mom and all that kind of stuff, but that's the truth. But the one thing I told myself, even as a child, was I'd never want to be that.
For sure.
I felt anger. I felt upset. I've screamed. I mentioned in the last podcast. I scream at the top of my lungs sometimes when we're both screaming at the top of my lungs. I want to make it just me, but we both lost our voices in arguments, and I felt rage. I felt those feelings. I'm sure my dad's felt those feelings, but I can never connect that rage to slapping my partner. And I think that's a more of a you problem. It's and the fact that you could do it confidently means you've practiced.
Yeah.
So I think you could have predispositions, but I don't care. It means nothing. I think if you know that you have it, you also have the ability to change it. It's because I know I have those predispositions. I know I have that nature. But the fact that I know it means I can change it. I think it's in any sort of thing. Somebody says, oh, I know I'm lazy, and you continue to be lazy. You know it, you can change it.
Yeah.
You know you're prone to anger, so why don't you change it? I think people feel comfortable in the things that they say they know, and they attach it to their identity. The difference between them and myself, which is why I don't like to talk about trauma, because I get sick of people saying, you know, I grew up with trauma.
Yeah, like a trauma Olympics.
Exactly.
Like, oh,
shut up.
I went through this hoop.
Shut up. I hate it, because I shut up and I stay quiet, typically.
Yeah.
Because, like, I'd rather enjoy my friendship. Mm-hmm. I'd rather enjoy the thing, and then see the good things I do, see the accomplishments I make, and then somebody asks me, what's your story? And then I tell them their story, and they're like, I would have never guessed. I had no idea that you went through all these things. Yeah, because I want what was in my past to be a fuel for my future. I want to show that despite these things, they don't define me. But I think people are so ready today to say that, to almost argue that they do define you, because you use it every single time you make a mistake. You use it every single time that you do something wrong. But the fact is, you know, and so I actually really agree with what you said. It's a maturity issue. You're an adult, you know it, so you have the ability to change it. And
I do have one question about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
We had a very similar experience. I'm just being a devil's advocate.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think seeing your dad slap your mom nurtured you into being like, I want nothing to be like that? Do you think if you had two happy parents, you would have been more of an angry person? Because that's so easy. I don't think about anything. You know what? It's easy to say maturity, because I went through the same thing. We're like very similar in that, right?
Yeah. That's why we're friends.
I used to see how my dad would treat my mom or us, and I'd be like, I don't want to be anything like that. Mm-hmm. But that was almost setting a role. He was being a bad role model that like enlightened me. Mm-hmm. So same would go for you. So I mean, technically nature was nurturing us in that regard.
Yeah.
But I do agree with what you're saying, is that at the end of the day, it comes down to you actively making decisions, which also kind of goes into relationships. You can actively be like, I'm going to do this because I know it'll make them happy, even though it annoys me or bugs me. It's like you can just not hit someone, you know?
Yeah.
It's like...
Before you go, there's an example I've heard, and I use this as well in church, but it's this idea of having the drunk father. Like let's say there's a drunk father has two twins, right? Two boys, both the exact same age, whatever, looks the same. They're twins. They have a drunk, abusive father. And as both the twins grow up, they both experience very different growths. One becomes very loving and caring and becomes the total opposite of their father. Whereas the other one becomes the spitting image of his father, also abusive to his wife, also abusive to his kids, and all those sort of things. And at the end of it, an interviewer asks, why did you become the way you became? And they have the exact same response, which is, I saw my father. Mm-hmm. And so I would argue it nurtured us because at a child's age, we chose, even as a child, that I don't want to be that. Mm-hmm. I think everyone can see the same thing. I think it's your choice how you want to, do you want to imitate that or not? I don't think we're idiots to where I see something and now I just replicate it. And even as a child, and yes, children are very susceptible, are very impressionable, sure. But I think even at a young age, it's about, I see something, do I want to replicate it? And that's the thing that I had to hold on for myself. There was no role model to attach or to reinforce into me. There was no, I didn't have anybody to look up to. I didn't have anybody I could talk to. I just wanted to keep having fun with my friends. But even at a young age, I just had to think to myself, and the thing is, I was watchful as in my own growth, and maybe maybe we're unique cases, I don't know, but as I grew up, I was watching myself sort of develop, if that makes sense. And I was thinking in this situation, let's say I got mad or I did something wrong, I think, am I becoming my father? And then I think to myself, even if I did something maybe remotely like that, I would immediately almost hate myself for it because I don't want to be that. And I think that's the problem, where people have that, just like the twins. They see their father, but because they like their father and they know those things are wrong, and that's the problem. They know those things are wrong. They know those things aren't okay. And so I think another distinction between the twins is one is an excuse and one is accountability. The accountability is, yes, this was my father. Yes, this was my past. This was my heritage. This is stuff that should have been instilled in me, but I'm going to make the change. The other one is, well, that was my father, so this is why I am the way I am. So I think the key difference between the two is accountability versus an excuse.
I hear what you're saying, and I don't think predisposition is everything. That's by no means what I was talking about either.
No,
predisposition is like, when you put it like that, it's a means to an end, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you were saying, hey, like I did A, B, and C behaviors because I grew up in a certain way. What I was more speaking towards is you are susceptible to those behaviors, and I think that, you know, what you said earlier, very, like about the two twins, right?
Yeah.
Resonates very strongly, but it also reminded me of a story where I heard like two twins are born to a parent, and then one twin gets sent overseas, and somehow that twin, regardless of their new environment, far away from their family, received all like you know, it was a spitting image of their parent in every single behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this wasn't like a abuse or like, you know, negative behavior story.
Yeah.
They were just like, simply they had all the same, like, you know, behaviors, you know, communication patterns, the way of being, just resembled their parents so much. So that's just really a comment on hereditary, you know, kind of like behaviors being passed on. But I think that ultimately, yes, it is what you make of it, right? Being able to make that distinction of what is right and what is wrong, and then holding yourself accountable as you go through the course of your life. What I think happens for a lot of people is that they are privy to the trauma, they witness the trauma, and of course, I think in 90% of cases, and don't hold me to that percentage, in most cases, people make the distinction that I don't want this to be my life. No. Like, I don't think anyone sees their parents' abusive behaviors, you know, whether that be domestic violence or, you know, screaming at each other constantly, or just being, you know, cursing at each other, whatever it might be. I don't think anyone sees that and says, I'm going to be like that. That's okay. Mm-hmm. I think in general, children are pretty, you know, perceptive, far more than, you know, what people believe, and in that they're able to assess, you know, what's right and wrong. They have a moral compass. Yeah. And so 100%. I remember it was moreover, and, you know, me and my partner too, I think it was just moreover like there were certain conditions that increased our predisposition, right? Mm. So like I wasn't this person, nor was she, prior to our relationship, ever. Like we had become our most toxic selves, screaming at each other at the top of our lungs, you know, throwing things around the household, and just you know, being absolutely toxic towards each other, gaslighting each other, you know, swearing at each other. It was a mess, right? And I'd never seen myself become that person. She also claimed that she had never seen herself like that before either. So it's like, all right, what were the conditions that fostered us to be more predisposed to our parents' behaviors? And I don't know if it's more of the predisposition part or if it was because of truly the hardships, right? The socioeconomic conditions that we were under. It was, could be, could be one or the other, could be a little bit of both. But I would say that the worst was brought out in each other because of other underlying factors, like lack of maturity, for instance, too, right? Very, very sort of like, I think it was premature of me to enter into that relationship and say, I can make it work, right? Immature, not premature. Yeah. And likewise for her, it was a relationship that wasn't destined for success. I knew that from the beginning based on all the red flags I had seen. So I can't put it all on predisposition. It was a series of decisions that we had made and continued making that led to these conditions where we were no longer in a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
Do you think, because hearing from what you're saying, we have a very similar experience. Do you think because of having this very bad relationship, you know exactly what you want in the future? Because I feel like with my situation, it'll be much easier to identify certain things right off the bat. Well, I'll know it's like, okay, I either need to take this slow or cut this off right now. Because before that, I talked to like one girl, and then we dated. I was always kind of Puritan, kind of just ingrained from my mom, like wait till marriage, all this. I was a very, very good kid, and then I met her, and then we dated, and then after that I had like a string of like little flings with people. But after that experience, I was like, okay, I haven't learned enough to say I can confidently be like, I will be 100% different. But I know things that I hold with high regard that I will not just let go anymore. Yeah. And I was just like, for like 2 years, I was like, oh, okay, I'll put up with this. Like, she did this, but she did this. And it was just like a series of like this or that, this or that. I feel like now it's like, there's certain things that just cannot happen. Or it's like, you're done. And I feel like I learned from it. Oh, how do you feel?
It definitely, so I mean, in the relationships I entered into afterwards, it definitely, like when I began to see some of those same behaviors or like similar patterns between each other, I was like, I'm out, right?
Yeah,
like I was like that. There's no, like, funnily enough, I dated a girl that was a lot like my ex, like in terms of personality, both very bubbly, very cute personalities, like we sharing kind of like similar love languages in terms of verbal affirmations, like otherwise like very like pleasant people to be around, right? But then it came down to the communication, and here's some of like the underlying factors that I would say like brought out our predispositions. Like one thing about like true love persisting is understanding how to navigate these currents of, all right, this person's been through these abuses or whatever experiences, and knowing not to trigger that, and vice versa, but also knowing that for yourself. Like you know yourself best at the end of the day. And I think that a sign of maturity is not just ignoring the red flags. Like if you know you are kind of prone to something, or that you've like for example someone doesn't communicate well with you, doesn't meet you halfway, like doesn't express gratitude well, and that's something that really peeves you off. Like, and you've had a history of like getting into arguments with a partner because of said reason, right? Then you should know yourself better not to enter into a relationship with that person. Yeah. Right? So it's an experience thing too, and experience is ultimately what fosters maturity, right? Yeah. 100%. So learning from my previous relationship, there was a girl I was seeing for a couple months, and she continually like she had like the similar behavior of like gaslighting me. So like if I said, hey, sorry, like I have to cancel our date in a couple of days, like we can hang out or something, but I can't like spend too much time, and then they come at my neck and say, oh, well, you don't even care about my feelings, like you don't care about this relationship, like this is just bullshit, like what's wrong with you? And I'm like, oh, right, I recognize this behavior. I'm not going to fall into the same trap again. I'm out. Right? So I think yes, experience is the teacher here, right? You can be predisposed to certain behaviors, but if you keep putting yourself in those situations where you are susceptible to those behaviors coming out, or these conflicts arising from you or from the relationship, it's on you, man.
Yeah. Oh, I know you're about to say something. I just want to apologize because I wasn't addressing what you were saying, so I don't want to mischaracterize that that's what you were trying to say. No, I know, but just for the viewer, I'm not trying to do that. But I just meant like that phrasing typically is taken, and then people run with it.
Yeah, people just use it.
Yeah, they use.
Well, I mean, think about star
Afraid
signs.
to admit that they're
Think about zodiac signs. I'm a Capricorn, so I punch people.
Yeah,
So you're
yeah.
Capricorn? I'm a
No,
Accountability.
I'm an Aquarius. I'm actually an Aquarius.
is
But-
lost.
No way.
But I think that's a great example of people that will say like, "Oh, I am this, therefore that's like what I am," and
it
like,
just
Yeah.
defines
and
our
it
identity.
it's just
Yeah.
defines who you are, and
Yeah.
I think it's actually a good example of
My
like
ex
how
was
you
one of
might
those.
use, and
That's actually a red flag for me now. It's like,
yeah, but yeah, it's like yeah. But anyways, appreciate clarifying. But one thing I was curious about is a couple things. I think both of you have mentioned repeated behaviors or repeated decisions that you've kind of witnessed over time, and we're kind of on this idea that like time is like a teacher, and like we should be learning and adapting and things like that, right? And so one thing I struggle with, so two questions for both of you. One question is, it's easy to identify red flags in your partners. Have you noticed red flags that have consistently popped up within yourself? The reason I ask that is, how are we all holding ourselves accountable to every relationship we enter? I think it's easy for me to say like, oh, as soon as a girl does this, that's a red flag. One thing I've noticed though, as I know is and I use as a litmus test, is if I start dating somebody, and I start noticing that I get overly jealous, then I need to hold myself accountable. It's not just me observing the girl and saying like, okay, there's some red flags I'm observing here. There's also red flags knowing that I'm predisposed to jealousy. Like I know my dad is, anyways, besides the point. The idea is that like, I know I'm predisposed to certain things. And so when I recognize them in myself, I have to address it and I have to say, I need to fix this or I need to work on it. Versus just saying like, oh, my partner's displaying these things, I need to get out. Right. And I think when we only look at, and I'm not saying that's what you guys are doing or what we're doing, but when we're only looking at someone else for the red flags and saying, okay, I need to get out, have we also self-audited ourselves and said, am I doing anything in this situation that is a red flag? So the reason I bring that up, so first question, have you identified red flags in yourself that consistently come up? Have you been able to work on them? And the second thing is, because of that, you both mentioned repeated decisions, repeated actions, things like that. Knowing that red flags are popping up on both sides, if you're witnessing these things continue to pop up, in what sense, in what scenario do you say we both need to work on this versus I'm getting out? Because I think there's always going to be like certain red flags, yellow flags in relationships, and I know many people have gone through different types of trauma. I find it hard pressed to find someone that maybe hasn't gone through something. I mean, obviously there are more people with privilege, things like that. But the reality is like everybody will have some sort of baggage, and the question becomes, well, is this a red flag that I'm running away from, or is this now accountability on both of our ends to fix our red flags? And that's the harder work. It's not, do you stick through the relationship through their baggage? I think that would be the shittiest position in the world. I think that the more reasonable question to ask is, we're not sticking through the baggage, we're sticking through the work that we're both doing. And if we can both get through the work, then we can achieve true love. But the reality is nobody wants to hold themselves accountable to the work that they have to do.
Yeah. So with your point of like holding yourself accountable, it's really hard because I really wish she would say more things to me. Like when she'd get mad at me, she's just like, you think you're so smart. Like, what do you mean by that? Like I never even understood what she meant by that, because she like never really had a reason to be mad at me. And I could have done better not being mad at her, but I wasn't just like, I wouldn't go on my way to bully her and pick on her. It'd be like little things that would build up, and I'd be like, okay, what the hell's going on? Well, thinking back on it, she would always just say that, like, oh, you think you're so smart. It's like, well, I don't know how to respond to that, because I definitely, John knows, I was big and fat, super insecure, all the way until I graduated high school, and then I lost a bunch of weight. And because of that, I've been my biggest self-critic my whole life. I've always analyzed, if I did something, I'm like, okay, I can't do that, like, that's bad. So I try my best to hold myself accountable. Now, obviously, you're gonna overlook some things. Like you're not gonna be like, oh, doing this is bad. This is bad. You know, my red flags for me is I tend to be on the lazy side. If I can like get something done as quick as possible and be done, I'm all for it. But as far as like being negative or anything in a relationship, I feel like I'm a pretty good partner in that regard. Like I'm willing to sacrifice. I'm willing to do things. I'm willing to show gestures of love. just to make sure that someone's feeling good, especially if they had a bad day. But like just things solely on what she used to say to me when we'd get in arguments, it always just led to, you think you're so smart. I'm like, I don't really know how to respond to that, because I'm just being logical, and I'm just talking about things just how they are. I'm not very in the ether type of person. I'm very emotional, but I'm not emotion driven. So like when people make things all about emotion, my logic will cut right into that. I'll be okay, well, let's not waste time with that. That to me, it's illogical, and it just makes things really muddy and gross. So I'm sure there are probably some things that I could do better, but I feel like all in all, I did a lot of the right things. I think maybe it was just our personalities after a culmination of issues kind of just resulted in this volcanic explosion of just nonsense.
I was kind of alluding to this before too, but like recognizing the behaviors in yourself that lead to fallout, right? So like for instance, like and here's the thing is that like transgressive behaviors, offenses aren't always about the init point. It's also about the response, call and response, right? So like I was mentioning before in my previous, short-lived relationship, like I recognize that like, okay, this girl is, getting into a gaslighty type mode with me, but if I were, in a different person's shoes, I could pass it off as maybe sassy, but I know what I'm prone to. I get frustrated. And so I'm like, I get exasperated, and I'm like, oh, and I'm, huffing and puffing, and I'm like, well, I just don't want to talk anymore. And I'm like, but is my frustration that warranted? And I mentioned this at the beginning of the pod, but that's one thing I really wish I would have been better about. So it is so I recognize that red light behavior in myself. And so when I broke it off, I was like, I don't think our communication pattern is very good. Let's try being friends first, and then, see if that's any better. But then the same communication pattern extended to our friendship, where I was like, I thought we were hanging out today. And I was like, we are. But I just have to meet you an hour later. Is that okay? Can you accommodate that? And it became a problem again. And I was like, well, that's where, and then I was like, all right, well, should I continue pursuing this friendship, knowing that it brings us both stress? It's bringing me stress to be in these conflicts where it's essentially irreconcilable, right? Yeah. Where it's like, well, who's really wrong here? Because it's not wrong of her to feel, jaded in that, or slighted is the right word, in the sense that like, all right, if I'm in her eyes, if I'm consistently not meeting her halfway on like punctuality or keeping promises, that's her right? And the same for me. It's like if there's this perceived like, all right, she's kind of like picking at little things and not being, very mature about, this situation, not being accommodating about, my busy lifestyle, right? That results in some of these like unkept promises or just like changes in schedule. Like that's my prerogative too. But to continue try engaging with this individual in the same exact way, that's on me. And vice versa too. So I mean, it's really like I recognize that red flag in myself, and so I've worked to mitigate that, right, over time, which in this relationship, that's kind of the parable, right? I learned from my previous relationship. I didn't want to repeat that again. I moved on.
Question for both of you. What's it's interesting because you've also referenced this as the idea of you've learned from your past relationship. My thinking is, if I meet the right person, I don't think I need that relationship to end for me to learn from it. I think it's as you go through that relationship, the right person will create the conditions for you to learn as you go. And that's another litmus test I think I use, is that if the relationship gets to a point where we don't believe we can continue to grow and learn and like fix these behaviors and issues together, and we break up, well, very clearly this wasn't someone that we could have gone through the rest of life with. If it's only been 3-4 years, you've reached a certain amount of disagreement on things, and then you break. I always find that language in myself interesting, of like, oh, I learned so much from my last relationship. Well, it's like, well, if I've only learned, and I'm speaking for myself at this point, if I've only learned after the fact, was I really treating this person like, and was I really learning within that relationship if I couldn't find it within myself to adjust course during that time? And there's dual accountability there. It's one, I have responsibility in myself to make sure that I'm self-auditing and self-fixing, but so does my partner. And that's why the partner is also super important. Love is, you can have love one way, love may not return. But at the end of the day, it's still dual reciprocality or reciprocation for you both to create the best possible conditions.
Yeah.
So you, in both cases, maybe both of you were putting out your best foot forward. You were both self-auditing, both self-learning. If your partner wasn't reciprocating, your partner wasn't helping create those conditions, then of course it's going to lead to some of these different kinds of issues. But that's the thing. I also find that interesting is well, then was that person really, one, in love with me if they weren't helping create the conditions to where we could grow together and get past these things? And two, I think and two, being the main point is if we're really learning, shouldn't we be able to do that in real time? And if we break before we're able to learn in real time, I would argue that that's a great indicator that this wasn't the person for me. And again, speaking for myself at this point, that's my self-audit, is the idea that if I need the relationship to end for me to say that I'm learning, something's really wrong.
Yeah.
I've witnessed glimpses of it, where maybe I've been in a relationship where I felt like we were growing at certain periods of times where we were making compromise. But that's the thing. If love is to continue, it's not just going to hold out for the honeymoon phase. It's going to continue through all the phases afterwards. And I think that's a great litmus test is once you get past that honeymoon phase, are you continuing to progress past those challenges, or does the relationship need to end for me to learn from it? And so
where I'll disagree there is that it's easy to audit yourself while you're in a relationship and then point out the variables of what's leading to. Shame on you, Matt.
I know.
It's your pod, man.
I know. Go ahead.
It's easy to audit yourself and point out the variables that lead to whatever leads to the conflict, right? And that arises, and then saying to yourself all right, well, I need to work on this. That's you running. That's you understanding the work that needs to go into yourself, and same for your partner, right? But it's hard to conduct self work, shadow work, when you're together all the time. It's for the same reason that I think athletes, when you're training with somebody, for example, you go to the gym and you have a buddy that you like to go to the gym with, there is a reliance on your gym buddy, your gym partner, to get the work done, is what I found. If you consistently go to the gym and you create the habit of going to the gym only when your gym partner goes, then that is not true self-work. That is a codependency, right? And so you are codepending on the other person in order to get the work done, right? And that is inherently not what self-work is about. Because at the end of the day, when that person goes away, have you really changed? Have you really developed the regimen and the discipline and the habits to say that I did the work by myself, I can continue to do this?
Right.
So,
I feel I'm curious. So I'm curious where the disagreement was, because I agree with you. I think where was the main point of disagreement? I'm curious.
Just that continuing to stay together. The idea that you should be have to exit the relationship in order to get learnings is wrong, right?
I don't believe that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm saying
that's
that's why I was saying the people that say oh, I've learned so much now that we've broken up. I'm you weren't learning when you were there. I think that's an incorrect thing that people are saying.
And I get what you're saying.
It's common for people to say, I've learned so much now that we've broken up. I'm did you if you guys broke up and it took that for you to get the learnings, then I would argue that person was not self-auditing during the relationship.
Yeah.
That's what I was arguing. I wasn't arguing that you 100% you should, but yeah.
No, totally.
In my relationship, I during it when we'd argue, I started teaching myself, okay, I need to go about this in a different manner. But I mean, honestly, if I was never in that relationship, I wouldn't have ever learned what it's like to even be with a partner. Because my whole life, I was just always on my own, always been very independent. Don't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
So I made a lot of sacrifices in the way I think. Just being with someone who was oh, let's do this today. Okay, let's watch this. I'm not down with that. But I don't know. I think I just lacked too much lack experience to really know how I can learn from a relationship, because I've only had one real relationship. Everything else was just like fun, you know, like
Right.
1 month, 2 month,
Yeah.
not even no hard feelings, just kind of just stopped talking, kind of withered off. Like, oh, I met
Right.
someone. So I mean, I don't know. It's something that I definitely could do more. Like, I guess introspection and see like what could I do to change and be better. But I think ultimately like the one thing that I saw was communication. Because there's just like there's never a time I was like, I don't want to say your name. Like, why are you upset? Like, I wouldn't just say that. I'd be like more direct because I already knew. But I could be more of like a listener. Like, why are you upset? Tell me. Like, is this causing this? Is this causing this? What can we do to fix this? I was never like an open conversation either. It'd always be like you or you from either of us. And it's like, instead of like, what can we do?
Yeah.
And going through the relationship, that's what I really learned. I learned throughout the relationship too, like with bickering. I think the only thing I learned though is what I don't like. I didn't learn like, oh, I really like this about someone, or this is very important to me. So there's just like so much just like negativity drowned in all the happiness that is like, I mean, I learned how to be a partner, but
Yeah.
at the same point, it's like, what did I really learn if like the relationship was so vitriolic and just so much tension and this and that and this and that? It's like, did what I learned, is it even going to be applicable to my next relationship if I meet someone who's really good? So it's just, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like a tricky question.
Yeah. I wonder that same thing too. Like, are the learnings from my previous relationship really applicable to the next relationship? Because if I enter into an ideal situation where I meet the right person, not necessarily the one, but the conditions are so different, it's removed from all this tension and conflict and just negativity, right? It's like, well, in my previous relationship, right, like one like aspect of our relationship that made it frankly enjoyable was the makeup, right? And just coming back from conflict and like it's weird because like now that we've learned, right, now that we've learned like, all right, like how to resolve our conflicts, we'd enter back into it again, but then like learn from that. And it's like we join that aspect of like, I think me and my long-term ex, like we both enjoyed the aspect of like we are able to meet each other halfway. We just keep entering into the same conflicts. But like that learning does nothing for my next relationship. Like the idea that like, oh, like arguments, you can bounce back from them. Like in continual conflict, you can kind of like find like, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel. You can find the silver lining. That does nothing for me, really. You know?
Exactly.
I kind of disagree.
I mean,
Well,
I get
both
what he's
you
saying.
guys,
I get what he's saying, because like ideally, if you find someone you love, it won't get to a place where it's so just like, I don't know, it's like more an open discussion, and hopefully it doesn't translate to, I get what you're saying. I guess coming from a place of like, my only real relationship was just so much just like,
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't think that's actually what love would be like, is the idea of like, oh, you find the perfect partner and now these conditions that you've had with your previous one never arise. I think it's the idea that when you find the right person that you love, should you even fall to those places where like you get into a heated argument, you're going to know based on previous experience that, wow, this is different. And I think that learning is important to know that, let's say like a rage-filled argument that I had with my first ex versus my second, I could tell they were very different. And that was an important learning for me, because if I didn't have the first, I wouldn't have context. I wouldn't have anything to kind of go off of. But I think the relationships you've had are 100% important, because now with, let's say with your partner that you do find like true love with, through the highs and the lows, you've been exposed to it all. You genuinely now can look at this and see like it. I guess my point being is with a true love partner, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have these lows, these really extreme lows. But you're going to see the difference, and you're going to understand that, hey, based on my past relationship, maybe when I reached this low with that person, I felt the need to leave or like go away, right? Whereas now with the new true partner that you found love with, that's created good conditions that you feel more comfortable with, now what you might recognize is going through that previous one is like, for her, I'm willing to stay in this space and have this argument. Whereas before, you know, you would have just left. So I do think whether or not we realize it, they have a ton of merit. It's just hard to realize now until we go through the hard things with the next partner. I didn't know how, like, granted, I'll give a lot of credit to my last ex. Like, we got much better at fighting than I ever did with my first ex, but I would have never had known that, nor would I have had the same experiences had I had that first experience with my first ex. So I think it's weird. It's like the idea that like you can only connect the dots after they've been placed and you kind of like look back. But yeah, I just find it interesting that like I also thought the same thing of like, oh God, this is a horrible relationship. Like, what am I possibly going to learn? But then I realized, oh, you know what? There was a lot to be learned here.
You become jaded is the thing, and
Yeah.
it's almost like a cringe, like
Super
oh, like
cynical.
why, like you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like I mentioned this because in my previous short-term relationship with the girl that was like my ex, like there was a very like it was uncanny what the response was to bickering and then making up. Because she was like, I like that. That's an attractive feature of you. And I'm like, as soon as I heard that, I was like,
Uh-oh.
I've got to leave.
That's a weird thing to be like, oh, conflict resolution. Yeah.
Literally, that's literally verbatim what they said. I was like, oh, this is
Yeah.
not good.
Yeah.
Here I am again.
I think the distinction, because I'm thinking about what all of you said, because yeah, it's true. Because as someone who has found true love, I probably have had the worst fights I've ever had with the one who I have true love with. And so that really got me thinking about what really is the distinction. And I think it's this, because I know there's the cliche of communication is key, but I actually don't think it's just that. I think it's almost more, I mean, we haven't really used this word, but transcendent. It's beyond just communication. It's more about seeing the person as an individual, and I don't want to use it in that wishy-washy sense. And what I mean is, I think a lot of times people enter relationships in a performative sense, where I'm the boyfriend, you're the girlfriend, or whatever way you do it, and then you're learning about the other person. But think about like a parent. You kind of give them a pass, like even speaking about my own father, you kind of give I don't give him a pass, but I understand why he does certain things. And I'm like, well, that's him. That's what he does. But I think what's different in most relationships, and I'm kind of working this out as I go, but I think what's different in most relationships is you don't see them as the individual, and you see them as either the boyfriend or the girlfriend. For example, she said, "You think you're so smart," is what she said. That's a dig at the person. She's not seeing you she's not understanding you as the individual.
Yeah.
She's seeing you as sort of this ethereal version of yourself, this sort of characterized version of yourself. For example, literally me and Kayla's last fight, we kind of did the dance. I'm fighting, we're both making points. We take turns and all that kind of stuff. She's kind of the one in the wrong, and she's seen me have my guard up and defensive. And then there's a point I just saw in her eyes where she just kind of like realizes he's defensive because I'm sort of attacking him. And she's like, I'm sorry. And you don't need to be defensive anymore. You can put it down. And I'm like, put what down? And then she's like, darling, put it down. It's okay. Like, I know I was in the wrong. And then I start like having like a twitch of a smile in my lips. And then she's like, okay, stop. And then we just start laughing. And then we start chuckling and laughing because she sees that that's a part of me that's a defense mechanism. She knows that's how I react when I do that. She's not attributing it to, and like you, like I tend to go on the very logical side and just make points. I'm like, yeah, all that aside, what's your point? Like kind of thing. Cut to the chase.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, none of that matters. What are you like that kind of thing. But she knows that of me, and she knows that's sort of my method or my tool, but she could see the me beyond that. Mm-hmm. And that's what I really think is the difference. Is the one key difference I found with my true love partner is when I would get into arguments with past partners, I never really saw them as the individual. I just know the points they're making. They know the points I'm making. We're arguing, we're bickering, but I don't see the person behind, or like they don't see the John behind what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really it. And I usually don't like saying terms, but yeah, does that person really see you? Do they see the person beyond even the person arguing at you? Do they see the person beyond the person who's being maybe is being smart, maybe or trying to be smart, being too logical, and on the same way, does the guy see the girl who's who is being emotional, and why they're being defensive in the way they do, and I think that really is it, because I think often it's you just need to communicate better, and of course you can learn all those things. Like you said, you can learn to be a partner and all those kind of things, but I think really at the end of the day is if you can see them as the person they are, beyond that they're your boyfriend or beyond that they're your girlfriend, if you could see them beyond that title and just see them as who they are, then I think all those other things will come through.
Yeah.
Because often, and in everybody's case, not even just YouTube, I think everyone's there was a pushback, and there wasn't, I was giving a lot and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, it really is about, do you really see them as a person? Do you see them, and I don't like using it as a person, but do you see like them?
Yeah.
Do you see them like
Their essence, their soul.
Because I don't like being like, do you see me? Like, no, not that. I'm not getting at that. I'm more, do you understand them like fundamentally as a person beyond like their behaviors? And that goes to the trauma thing. Like Kayla knows my own defense mechanisms that comes up due to trauma. And that's why she handles it that way. She knows I go cold, and I become more just a machine and just logical. And I don't, and she's even acknowledged is when my triggers do happen, I flip like we call it like a switch. Like a switch comes on, and I told her honestly, and that's communication. I told her honestly, in that moment, I do not feel like I care about you. But then she knows that's what's happening to me, and she knows that there's a person deep down that wants to care about her. And because she understands that, she's not faulting me for that. Whereas like in your past relationship where she goes, you think you're so smart, that's faulting you for doing things that she should know if she loved you.
Yeah. And that always used to bother me, because it'd be like, okay, then I'm like you. That's probably why we're such good friends. When I would argue, I would just kind of shut down. It's like, this isn't going anywhere. You're going to say stupid things like that. And then I'd shut down, and then she'd gaslight me like, oh, so you just don't even want to resolve this? I'm like, where is this going? Like, you're saying I'm too smart, and then you want me to keep talking to you? It's like, I don't know what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
Like, just think about how people need to be able to see you if they can truly love you. You know me. I'm sarcastic. Mm-hmm. That's like me. Yeah. She would always get mad when I'd say something sarcastic, and not even just like at her. If I just said something just stupid, Yeah. She'd be like, "Oh, don't say that," or "That's mean," or "Why would you say that?" I'm like, "Oh my gosh, you don't even like." That's like who I am.
Exactly.
You don't know who I am.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that was hard for me.
Question for you on the flip side: do you know why she was asking you those things?
What do you mean? Like, why am I so smart?
No. Yeah. Like, why would she ask you those things? Like, what do you think?
I think that was her defense mechanism, personally, because she wasn't very good with her words, and I'm someone who's just like, I like to communicate what I think. I had 3 sisters and a gay brother. I shared a room with my brother my whole life. I have just nothing but open dialogue. My family is very, very open. Should have heard the conversations John and I used to have back in the day, like philosophical or anything. It was just I'm very open about my thought process, and I think it was just like one of her coping mechanisms. I think she just never had that kind of, I don't know, depth in a relationship before, and I don't think she knew how to like respond. And maybe I was at fault. Maybe I was like putting her in a corner and trapping her. Yeah. But like, I never did that intentionally. It was literally I would observe something, talk about it, and then I'd get that response. Yeah. It's like.
Yeah, and since this camera's rolling, I wasn't trying also to like fault or anything, or like kind of get you with anything. I was more curious because I think like I've noticed too in myself with like when you bring up the idea of like, oh, like they always did this, and it's interesting because you kind of speculated like, oh, I think it was because of this, but just the fact that you never actually got to the answer, whether through communication with her, I think me too. I've never gotten to that point with a lot of previous exes. Is I could always speculate about why they were doing things, but the fact that I never got to it with them means that we never actually
talked about it.
We never actually talked deep enough to understand what was really going on. Otherwise, I would have been able to tell you immediately. And that's again to my last ex's credit. I can tell you exactly why some of the defense mechanisms were coming up, or like I could identify them. I couldn't do that with my first ex. So, step in the right direction. Things didn't work out for other reasons, but it's the idea of like now. I mean, this honestly just came to me now thinking back of like, if I couldn't tell someone now, like immediately, why my ex did those things, it means that we never got to the level of understanding where I knew exactly what was going on.
Yeah, no, that's true.
You know,
I definitely never got there.
yeah.
I mean, I never really wanted to ask. You know, it's like, okay, why even continue this conversation?
Yeah.
Honestly, that's a good point, though. Honestly, in the future, maybe I'll have to be a little more digging. Like, okay, why are we having this kind of argument?
And maybe that's a good litmus test. Is like you mentioned, like you didn't really want to take it further, but for the right person, I think you might find that you do want to take it further and understand. You know what I mean? Maybe that's a great litmus test to understand. Is like with this new partner, I really want to know why. Yeah. Whereas before, I didn't really care to know why. This person, I do.
Yeah.
You know?
And like with those arguments, you know, I got to a point where I was like, I already understood. This probably isn't the best thing. Yeah. And it was an unhealthy relationship to begin with because you kind of put that shadow on the relationship and then pretty much anything goes, you know? Yeah. So, no, that's a good point.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, that is the distinction I think that I made in assessing my past relationship too, whether it was true love or not, because we both moved on from the projection of, well, you're my boyfriend, you should be doing, you know, what I think a boyfriend should do, and versus, you know, my own projection of what a girlfriend should be doing, right? Yeah. It became, I know that you're who you are and you have these core values, and that the way, you know, we're living our lives in this relationship together, our core values aren't aligning. We finally saw each other for the other person. Yeah. And that's why we were like, okay, well, now we can move on, because no longer were we, you know, kind of putting each other in the position of, you have to meet my expectations of what a boyfriend is. It's now, or, you know, or what a partner is. It's now, you are who you are, and that isn't aligned with who I want my partner to be. Yeah. And so, you know, therefore,
damn. Yeah. It's hard for a lot of people to say. A lot of people will just kind of toss it up to like it was a personality difference, or like it was conditions. But to actually go forward and say like, we saw each other for who we were, and we just flat out decided like, this is not, like, we don't match. That's a lot harder I think for a lot of people to say. Like most people do not say that. They would rather say, it's not you, it's me. Or actually, what do you call it? Like they say that cliche is wrong, but I'm like, no, that is right. Like if it's you, like, and it's me. Like we're clearly not meshing, and like, but most people won't go to that route to say that. They'll just kind of like let it skid on by and say like, oh, personality mismatch, timing, whatever have you. But yeah, nice. Yeah. I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, I think time to close.
Yeah.
I think that was
a good closing.
Really good.
Yeah, it was a really good one. Yeah.
I think honestly we could keep going.
Yeah, we could,
like
but
other hours. But I think that's a good place. But I really want to commend that, because, like you said, not a lot of people say that. That it really is you. Like, we saw each other for who we are and still decide to leave. I think that's an awesome thing.
Yeah, I appreciated that later on, and it's interesting because, you know, I know like before I was like, well then, you know, before I was like, well, she just didn't have any true love for me then. But year and a half down the line, now I'm like, we made that decision. She made that decision consciously, knowing that if I really love this person and I know exactly who he is, I can't continue being in this relationship and hurting him, and conversely too. Like we're just going to only hurt each other. It doesn't make sense for it to be together anymore, despite, you know, what we feel towards each other. So yeah.
No?
Cool.
No, I know. There was like a ton of other couple stuff, but I think
there's a lot.
There's a lot.
Honestly, if you guys want to come back,
if you guys want to come back on,
because they're like, even just that last one, I know that there's more we can talk about. Like, even just the last few things everybody said, there's still more we can talk about. So
in my head there was like a list.
I know.
I was like,
I know,
pointed things you guys said, but I'm like, but it's good conversation. But I know each thing will, like,
Yeah, yeah.
blow up.
I don't know if you want to return or if you want to return, but like I think that would be honestly.
No, I
I'd
think
be,
it's a good place to
I'd be
close.
cool with it. Yeah. No, I meant like not
No,
now.
come
I meant
back
like
to the pod.
to come back to the pod.
I'm
in the
always
future,
down.
yeah.
now I'm more comfortable
Yeah.
with things aimed at my
Yeah.
face and lights. You know.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it takes
At
a
first,
bit.
I was kind of.
I'm
like,
still
oh my
not
goodness.
comfortable.
Yeah, I was kind of like, oh my god.
Oh, this was really good though. Really good.
I went to drink water. I was like, I better
Yeah.
not do that. People just seem like, ugh.
Yeah. All right, well, I think that's where we're closing. Thank you for watching Better Questions. Please like and subscribe, and more importantly, leave a comment if you have any questions with anything we talked about, anything dealing with true love at all. We might address it in one of the next podcasts, so please leave your comments. Anyways, so that's the end. Thank you, and see you next time.
Adios.
Nice.
You should have your best. Like, if you're trying to find true love with me.
No, but honestly,
No, but seriously,
great guys.
Yeah.
Of course.
What did you guys think of the podcast?
I liked it.
And what do you think of the format? How do you think we tackle things? Like, I just want to know, as a guest, your guest experience.
I like it. You know, for me,
How did you?